And we're back in the car, not driving, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of this reasonably, somewhat chilly Sunday here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Today is Warren Beatty's 88th birthday. And unlike his peers, Redford, Nicholson, and Hoffman, those are really the only three, Beatty is a bit of an elusive figure for film fans under 40 because he has been mostly retired for quite some time. And some people, the only memory of him they have is he and Faye Dunaway completely cocking up, although it wasn't their fault. They gave him the wrong cards. At the 2017 Oscars, Steve Harvey had to come out and say, well, we just had a major fuck up, congratulations to the wrong movie. So of all of the people in Hollywood, the last person that you'd ever want to have seen, if you know his history, as this sort of doddering old man, Warren Beatty. Like, he's the last guy that you would ever have wanted in that capacity. Again, it wasn't his fault. He had the wrong card. It was a fuck up. Unbelievable. But Warren Beatty, I'm trying to think of the last big movie. He did the film where he played, I think he played a version of Howard Hughes in 2017. I don't remember the name of the movie. It supposedly wasn't very good. But he is somebody who, after a certain point in time, started to take more time between projects, as if he was becoming protective or cautious about his legacy. And after the disaster that was Ishtar with his buddy, speaking of Dustin Hoffman, that movie was just catastrophically bad. And after that, Beatty then became very, very careful. And he'd always been somebody who picked projects with care. He wasn't somebody who, once he got out of the first phase of his career, needed to work just for the sake of working. He wanted to believe heart and soul in whatever project he was going to undertake. And you go all the way back, and his name came up about a month or so ago when the Robert Pattinson film Mickey 17 came out. And for film geeks like me, I see the title Mickey 17, and my first thought isn't, oh my God, Robert Pattinson's so hot, or he's amazing, or I fucking hate that guy. I hate Twilight, and I hate him, and I've hated him for 20, whatever. Oh, he sucked in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. No, none of that. When I saw there was a movie called Mickey 17, I immediately thought back to Arthur Penn's 1965 film called what? What was it called? Mickey 1. Mickey 1. Warren Beatty plays a stand-up comic, oddly named Mickey 1. It stands to reason. You ask yourself the question, you have Mickey 1 in 1965 and Mickey 17 in 2025. What happened to Mickey's 2 through 16? I don't know. But Mickey 1 in 1965, it showed Warren Beatty as a different kind of an actor. Somebody who was pausing, not really like a stage performer, who was taking in the mise-en-scène, all of his surroundings. He just was registering differently. And by 1965, he had made Splendor in the Grass, which was it made a huge splash with Natalie Wood, the somewhat tragic Natalie Wood. And the first film that put him on the map as far as this is a superstar, this is a generational talent, was Bonnie and Clyde, also working with the aforementioned Arthur Penn. And Bonnie and Clyde is one of those movies that signaled a shift in Hollywood and in the kinds of movies that the studio system were willing to push forth. Now, there are different levels of the studio system. They don't really call it that anymore, but me being old school and old head who got out of New York University almost 3 decades ago, I still say the studio system. But what that implies is there are multiple levels. There are studio features that are big budget studio features that cost a couple of $100 million. But then there are studio features where the studio only paid for a small portion, or maybe they're just going to handle the marketing. Warren Beatty experienced both of those kinds of filmmaking. A movie like Mickey 1, a filmmaker like Arthur Penn, an auteur director, he could work within the system, making lower budget, or he could make bigger budget. But Bonnie and Clyde in particular, with Faye Dunaway, that's why they were up there, like the 50th anniversary, I guess it would have been, why they were up there giving the Best Picture award that year. And I think it was that they said that La La Land was the winner, but it was actually Moonlight. I'm sorry if I got that wrong. I just remember a lot of people saying, why did they have to embarrass Warren Beatty? Why couldn't it have been somebody else? It could have been Robert Pattinson. It could have been anybody screwing up. It should have been Steve Harvey opening the envelope, and he could have made a couple of jokes like he was on the Family Feud. But Bonnie and Clyde signaled a shift. That movie, and the other one that I immediately would think of, Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, which was released a little bit later. But there's graphic violence, there is R-rated stuff going on. And before those two movies, there was no rating system. When I talk about the studio system, there was this really archaic thing called the production code, where movies had to conform to a certain standard and standards of decency. Now, if you ask me, who decides what decency is? Good question. Because nobody really ever decided what it was. It was a couple of people at the Legion of Decency. I mean, it kind of is supposed to be funny now. It looks funny. The Legion of Decency? Well, who's making those decisions? Is it the church? Who is it? I don't know. But in the same way, when the MPAA was formulated right around the time of The Wild Bunch and Bonnie and Clyde, it was a step in the right direction as far as major filmmakers could now could make movies with graphic violence, with, heaven forbid, a little sex, and themes that previously you could only hint at. Because in the movie Psycho, they really don't go into as much detail as Robert Bloch's novel, showing the real, like the visually representing the degradation of somebody like a Norman Bates, as opposed to just hinting at it and giving us an idea. But Bonnie and Clyde was a film that a lot of the old guard of movie critics did not like. The Bosley Crowthers and people such as that, the movie critics who were going back to the 40s and 50s. And they thought the film was disgusting, disgraceful to make a movie where we're supposed to be celebrating criminals. Sound familiar? They talked about it with The Godfather years later. They talked about it with The Sopranos on TV. Why are we glorifying Tony Soprano? But the counter argument is we're not. We are simply showing a portion of life. There are crime families. That is a real thing. You live the high life, but at a certain point, it's going to come back, bite you in the ass. You're probably going to end up in a ditch somewhere. You see what happens, not just in movies, but movies based on real life. Most of them don't really meet a particularly good end. But that is a fair debate. What's the line between glorifying and being open and honest in the world of a movie? Well, Bonnie and Clyde, I think, is pretty straightforward stuff. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, I guess, were the actual people. And the film kind of tanked at the box office. And Warren Beatty, already showing the confidence of a guy who had been around, he'd been in the business for a little bit less than a decade. But Warren Beatty decided that he was not going to accept that this film had bombed, that this was not a great movie, because he believed in it. He believed in Arthur Penn, and he believed in his co-star, the somewhat intimidating, even back then, Faye Dunaway. She's somebody who, there are certain actors and other people she's worked with that said she was really difficult to deal with. Problematic. We'll just use that word. But then there are people that say, no, she was an absolute doll. But there were more on the side of, she's difficult, she's a holy terror. But Warren Beatty came forward and he confronted, not literally, it wasn't like Sylvester Stallone threatening to beat up a guy that gave Staying Alive a shitty review back in 1982. But he demanded that the film get another look. These film critics are out of touch, and this movie needs another opportunity to connect with audiences. And I don't know how he pulled it off, but he managed to convince the studio, the powers that be, to put the film back out. And new film critics raved about it. And Bonnie and Clyde became a culturally significant film. Much like, well, to some extent, The Wild Bunch, but that was more for the graphic violence. But like The Graduate was a movie that a few years earlier could not have been made at all No, thank you. No chance does The Graduate get made. A film about a young college graduate who starts having an affair with the wife of his father's business partner. Then he falls in love with the daughter, and let's just kumbaya, be one big happy family. Yeah, good luck with that. You have a better chance of meeting Jesus, as they say. But challenging films that did not conform to the production code from back in the day, that gave the double middle fingered salute to, because the Legion of Decency didn't exist anymore, but a lot of filmmakers were still thinking about it while they were making their movies. Hollywood cinema got better. For all the complaining and for all of the arguments back and forth about Hollywood this, Hollywood that, people love to argue about today, but you go back to the 60s. These were all steps in the right direction. Now, the MPAA didn't end up really being a step in the right direction because it amounted to little more than censorship. But once filmmakers were allowed to make movies the way they wanted to in terms of violence, in terms of sexual content, in terms of real life human emotions being splayed up there, the good, the bad, and the ugly of all of it, Hollywood really went into another level. And the blockbuster era, it was not an accident. It was because there was so much more creative freedom. And again, the double-edged sword, the MPAA in some ways limited it. But it's like they took 3 steps forward to take a step and a half back, would be how I would describe this particular facet of it. But Warren Beatty was at the forefront. And if he had not literally fought for Bonnie and Clyde and for his filmmaker, who he adored, Arthur Penn, we don't know. He certainly wouldn't have become as big a star, and that movie would not have it would have had to be rediscovered a decade later. But again, there was no process to do that because there's no streaming. There isn't even any VHS. A movie had to go back into theaters. It couldn't just, oh yeah, we'll get it on home video. What's that? That's a decade away. Well, we'll get it on cable. Yeah, that's 5 years away. You want to just keep going and keep embarrassing yourself? No, there was no process. So Beatty's career ascended. But in a similar context to Robert Redford, Redford was a pretty big star before Beatty became a pretty big star. Redford was not a writer, but he was somebody who had an eye for producing and directing. Clint Eastwood, a little bit older, 6-7 years older than Warren, was already just about the biggest star at the time of Bonnie and Clyde. Clint was knocking on the door of global superstardom, but he had taken control of his career. And Warren Beatty, I don't know that he necessarily interacted with Clint in that era. It's not as easy as today where you could just text somebody, even if you don't really know, hey, Clint, this is Warren. I got a couple of questions I'd like to ask you about your production company. But Warren Beatty took control as much as one can without doing the Clint Eastwood Malpaso Productions on the Warner Brothers lot. But Warren Beatty wanted to be more involved in his films than simply showing up, hitting his marks, and acting. He showed an aptitude for writing, and he saw himself as a budding filmmaker, as somebody who could produce movies as well. And the thing is, because he stopped working regularly so young, and when I say so young, by the time he was in his mid-50s, he was part-time and pretty much had enough already. And the man was nominated for 14 Academy Awards. 14. The last one being a film he did in the late 90s, which was expected to make a much bigger splash than it did. It actually was with a very young Halle Berry, Bulworth. That was his final Oscar nomination. It was for Best Screenplay, which he co-wrote with another writer. 14 Oscar nominations across all the categories: acting, writing, directing, producing. He was a quadruple threat. He did everything well. He's a very resourceful actor. He could be funny. He could be serious. He could play good guys. He could play bad guys. He could play both. As in the case of the movie Bugsy, where the story is filtered through his perception, can't exactly call him a good guy, but we kind of root for him because we see where he's coming from and we almost buy into his dreams. Like, you could have somebody that you think is terrible, but it doesn't mean that every idea they have sucks. But anyway, I didn't want to get into Bugsy as quickly as that, but I was saying in a movie such as Bonnie and Clyde, we get behind them, but only up to a point. And it's a very interesting thing in movies, Leonardo DiCaprio talked about this with regards to his first experience when he was old enough to understand watching Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, which he also would consider to probably be Scorsese's masterpiece. He wouldn't say that because of the number of movies they made together. What he said, he says, up to a certain point in the film, we are with Travis Bickle. We're with him. We're rooting for him. We want him to get together with Betsy. She seems like a nice enough lady. Yeah, okay, she looks like a whatever, a goddess, the whole thing. But we're with him. And then at a certain point, we're not. We say, oh my God, I was rooting for this lunatic? Bonnie and Clyde, there is a similar moment where we start to almost feel uncomfortable. Wait a minute, we were on their side? No, this is not okay. And that audience alienation, the willingness to do that, to not have conventional hero-villain structures. Now, we've seen plenty of it, but up to the late 1960s, it wasn't really done that much. Now, a later film, 1971, top 10 greatest movie years ever. 1971 was the year of Dirty Harry, Clockwork Orange, The French Connection, and the late, great, independent, but also worked through the studio system filmmaker, similar to Arthur Penn, Robert Altman, did a Western with Warren Beatty and Julie Christie, who Warren would work with a few more times, McCabe and Mrs. Miller. I don't like that movie. I've seen it. I watched it in film school in a class called, not surprisingly, The Western. It's my least favorite Warren Beatty film. I find it to be very slow and kind of dull. And Quentin Tarantino, who is a big Altman guy, doesn't really like it. He says, yeah, there's certain sequences that are absolutely brilliant. He said, but I don't know what Robert was doing. The sound mix is weird. I didn't get any of that. You know, Tarantino talking a million miles a minute. Wasn't a fan. Neither was I. But I would never have said, well, I didn't like the movie. I thought the sound mix sucked. That would not really be on my top 50 things that I could complain about with a movie. With Tarantino, it was the first thing he brought up. But McCabe and Mrs. Miller is a film where Warren's character, he's not really a good guy, but he's the hero, playing amoral characters, but we're still filtering our perception through them. And I mentioned a few weeks ago, for example, Michael Douglas specifically in Basic Instinct, but in many other movies, Michael Douglas plays the protagonist, but he is not a likable guy. And Warren Beatty, ultimately Clyde Barrow, is not really that likable. And McCabe and Mrs. Miller, I don't know about this guy. And then you go forward in his career. The Parallax View, I guess you could say that's more of a conventional hero, where he is a reporter. I think was he a reporter? But he's investigating a series of killings. It's a political thriller. Let's just put it that way. And Alan J. Pakula, another really interesting filmmaker from the era. He did a lot of great movies. And even into the 90s, his last film, The Devil's Own, with Harrison Ford and Brad Pitt. But he also did the adaptation of Presumed Innocent. But Parallax View spoke to the time itself, as opposed to looking at, let's advance Hollywood. And the 70s became a kind of golden age and golden era for auteur filmmakers making these very personal projects on the studio's dime. It's very difficult to get that done now. You've got to be a huge filmmaker, such as a James Cameron, a Spielberg. You have to be at that exalted level because nobody wants to spend it any more than they need to. And that has nothing to do with what time frame it is. It's just simple business. It's the bottom line. You look, David Zaslav is still pissed off about the failure of Joker 2. But as they also pointed out in various articles you can find, the only way that they were going to get a sequel, because think about how much money the first movie made, they had to give Todd Phillips creative control. They had to let him do what he wanted. Again, double-edged sword. You have so much power, and if shit goes wrong, often the wrong people get blamed. But Beatty did this film in the mid-70s called Shampoo, where he plays a hairstylist. And the real-life Warren Beatty was, for decades, Hollywood's most eligible bachelor. And, you know, the joke was that his little black book contained names you wouldn't even believe. That he got together with almost every starlet in Hollywood for 30 years. Everybody from Mamie Van Doren to Madonna, who I wouldn't necessarily call a Hollywood starlet, but he supposedly got with every one of his leading ladies, starting with Splendor in the Grass, and maybe even before that. He was just, the only woman who seemed salty was Carly Simon, is how I would describe it. There are people that you would think would have been a little bit pissed off that he stopped calling them or whatever, but there was something, he had a presence and a personality, and you could find a ton of interviews of various women talking about what it was like to be in his circle, in his sphere. I think that he got with every major female in the Shampoo. We knew that he had been with Julie Christie already, but Lee Grant and probably Goldie Hawn, he just kind of cut a swath, that's what she said, through Hollywood. It was just, I don't know if it was part of his process, but it's just what he did. Isabella Gianni with, Ishtar. She a French actress? Yeah, Isabella Gianni. She did the, not good, the remake of Diabolique with Chaz Palminteri and Sharon Stone and Kathy Bates. Thumbs down. Don't remake Henri Georges Clouzot. For anyone in the future, don't remake that guy. Just leave it alone. Let sleeping dogs lie, as they say. But Beatty was this sort of personality. He was very ingratiating, and he was a born people person, and he seemed to he wasn't bothered by the schmoozing aspect of being who he was. Always ready with a smile, and people who knew him well, they said this guy's a genius. He may not look like somebody with a 160 IQ, but this guy, you listen to him talk for a couple of minutes, man, what a brilliant guy. So he made a lot of films which were timely, products of their time, which means that they don't play as well now. Shampoo was a huge hit. It's a movie that a lot of the political and philosophical stuff, you'll say, what the hell are they even talking about? So that's a film that's more of a cultural artifact as opposed to something that is timeless. But he did the film called Heaven Can Wait, also with Julie Christie, in the late 70s. And that is a football movie. It deals with a guy who is a quarterback for the Los Angeles, with the LA Rams. And I think they were the LA Rams at that particular time. And it's a remake of a film about a guy who dies before he's supposed to die and then gets to come back to Earth and get it right. And that's the first Warren Beatty film that I saw. I watched it with my dad on HBO. I was about 7, maybe 8 years old. It made enough of an impression on me that even as a kid who, I was interested in movies, but I was a little kid. I watched Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey every time it was on HBO. I just was mesmerized by it. But Heaven Can Wait it's a good movie. It's a comedy. It's a sports film. It's kind of inspirational. But if I didn't know all of the other stuff with Warren Beatty being a womanizer or a ladies' man or Lothario, whatever word, he was just a terrific actor, and he was believable in what amounts to a couple of different roles in the film. And he looked the part. He looked like a guy who could have been an athlete. And this was something with Robert Redford they talked about when he did The Natural in 84, even though he was in his mid-40s, that Redford he was such an incredible athlete, they had to tell him to strike out in certain spots. Bro, you look too good up here. You're not supposed to hit a home run or where we think it's a home run with this swing. We need you to swing through it. And he found it difficult to do so. But Warren Beatty, a guy built like an athlete, he looks like he could have been a quarterback just in terms of the physicality. It's not one of those where you say, well, this isn't believable. This little guy, he could never play quarter. Okay. But as far as critical acclaim, his next film, Reds, about the American, I think he was a journalist, John Reed. And it was set right around the time frame of the October Revolution, the Russian Revolution. And this is a movie that is a difficult watch. It is not a fun 3 hours at the movies. Great cast, Diane Keaton and Jack Nicholson playing Eugene O'Neill, like really interesting casting. Then funny, I forgot that he worked with Nicholson there too. The film got broad acclaim, and there were many who thought it was going to win Best Picture in the year of Raiders of the Lost Ark, On Golden Pond, and the eventual winner, and my single favorite movie of all time, Chariots of Fire. When Warren Beatty won the Best Director Oscar, and I mentioned the 14 Oscar nominations, the only win was Best Director for Reds. And when he did not win Best Picture, when Hugh Hudson and Sir David Putnam and Chariots of Fire ended up taking the big prize, the gallery, everyone was in shock, because many years Best Director ends up winning Best Picture. And I got to be honest with you, Hugh Hudson's direction is the reason why it's such a great film. He didn't have that big of a career after that. He did Greystoke and he made a couple of other movies, but man, one masterpiece for Hugh Hudson, good enough. Chariots of Fire, it's just a marvelous movie. But when I think of Beatty, the first movie nowadays that I think of is Bugsy, which was 1991, the year after he did Dick Tracy with Madonna and Al Pacino and Dustin Hoffman. Just an amazing all-star cast. I love that movie. Madonna is not distracting. I like her performance as Breathless Mahoney. I thought Dick Tracy was fantastic. It did pretty well at the box office, but the hope was it was going to turn into a franchise, and it didn't turn into a franchise. It didn't do quite well enough. It grossed just over 100. But he appears in Madonna's Truth or Dare documentary in 1990. It came out, I'm sorry, it was shot in 1990 as she was on her Blonde Ambition tour, and she and Warren had gotten together. They were boyfriend and girlfriend. It was completely above board. And he appears in the Truth or Dare documentary, which came out the following spring, 1991. Filmmaker Alec Kashishin, who later made a movie that is another Gen X standard with honors, with Brendan Fraser, Patrick Dempsey, Moira Kelly, and Joe Pesci in a supporting role. But Warren Beatty was so careful and so canny. He was a very keen observer of human nature. And in the documentary, Truth or Dare, he seems to predict the future. He's sitting there and Madonna is on camera and the cameras are rolling. You could see that he cares about her, but he's uncomfortable being on camera. It's strange. The guy who is one of the biggest movie stars ever, he's uncomfortable just sitting there. And he's asked a question by Alec. He says, do you think that she always wants to have the camera on? And Beatty says she doesn't want to live off camera. And in a Kardashian world, that was pretty prescient that he thought of that he believed that she already, in his estimation, Madonna was somebody that wanted to have a camera on 100% of the time. She doesn't want to live off camera. Now, the relationship didn't go that much further, but there are a lot of pictures of them together, and they really look good in Dick Tracy. They had good chemistry, not surprisingly. But the somewhat failure of Dick Tracy meant that Warren Beatty could finally commit to Barry Levinson's Bugsy, a movie that he had been circling, and now he finally, let's go make a fucking movie. And that, I believe, is the best film that Warren Beatty was ever in. The best movie, and he should have won, dare I say, he should have won Best Actor over Anthony Hopkins, because as I've said before, Hannibal Lecter is a supporting character. That is not enough of a performance, in my opinion, to win lead. And Beatty is in almost every scene of Bugsy and is absolutely incredible in that movie. Got 11 Oscar nominations, and I believe it won 2. And after that, he really slowed down. He and Annette Bening got together. He stopped his kind of, wandering eye, or whatever phraseology you want to use. They've been together for more than 3 decades. And they did Love Affair, a remake of An Affair to Remember, and a little bit, more than a little bit, a Sleepless in Seattle kind of a story, basically. He just didn't do very much after the relative failure of Bulworth. Then he did the movie called Town and Country, which took forever to be released. I don't know why. It was just a trifle. They made it seem like it was going to be something great, and it sucked. He pretty much just walked away. And that's what I mean by talking about him being something of an elusive, difficult to pin down, because there are a lot of younger people who maybe know the name, but don't understand just how much this guy has meant to cinema. What a, kind of an end boss type of an individual he is and has been. And I hope that he's in good health. When he's made public appearances, he still seems astute and sharp. And yeah, he stopped coloring his hair many years ago. He's sort of accepted the fact that he is now in his upper 80s. And yeah, his contemporaries, Dustin incredibly is still working. Jack is retired, and Redford is retired as far as acting, but I think that he's still, as much as he can, running the Sundance Film Festival. I feel like there are a couple of films in production that he may have had a hand in. So Redford is still involved, and Dustin Hoffman is still working, which it's just fucking crazy to me. But this is what he loves, and some people don't need it. And in the case of Warren Beatty, I don't think that he needed to work. He had to really believe in it. And I respect that. I mean, I respect people who feel they have to work or otherwise they wouldn't know what to do with themselves. But I also don't think that we are owed anything. It's okay that Warren Beatty scaled back so much in his mid-50s. He didn't want to work full-time anymore. He had enough money. He'd already had 13 Oscar nominations by that point. You do something else. Enjoy the fact that your wife is now almost as big, well, maybe not almost as big a star, but Annette Bening, how many Oscar nominations has she gotten? What a great actress. But yeah, Warren Beatty is one of those people you could talk about for hours and not repeat yourself. Just an amazing life. Not as divisive a personality as I think if he had done some of the same stuff today in the social media argument, he wouldn't have been able to do it. The little black book. No, he wouldn't have been able to do it. But he is certainly a fascinating personality, a great character, a genius, and somebody who was just good at whatever he tried. Anything connected to the movie business, he was just great at it. And, somebody worth remembering. And for those who only know him by name, you look into his career, you see the number of legitimately great films that he was a part of, whether it was just actor or whether it was the triple threat actor, director, producer. Answers D, all three. Happy 88th birthday to the one and only Warren Beatty. This has been episode number 480 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your Sunday afternoon here with me in New York. And if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.